The story might be said to have begun in the March of 1937, when after a first winter of stalemate around Madrid, General Franco ordered his forces to direct their attention towards the events in the north. General Mola was placed in charge of the northern campaign, and he immediately proclaimed, "I have decided to terminate rapidly the war in the north. If surrender is not immediate, I shall raze Vizcaya to the ground. I have the means to do so." Within a matter of days, he had demonstrated the means at his disposal. In the early morning of the 31st of March, a detachment of the Condor Legion, which was the section of the German Air Force that was serving with the Nationalists, bombed the small town of Durango. A total of 127 bodies were taken from the wreckage. A further 121 died subsequently. This was warfare of a new kind. Systematic aerial bombardment of undefended targets which had no military purpose. It was a rationally calculated move to undermine an enemy's morale by terrifying its civilian population. But surrender? There was no surrender. Nor from the Basques was there any likelihood of it. There was, however, a very keen interest in securing the evacuation of women and children from the war zone. President Aguirre of the newly established Basque regional government had discussed this with Ralph Stevenson, the British consul in Bilbao. And Stevenson submitted the idea to the Foreign Office in London. Furthermore, he was able to report to the Foreign Office that he had been in discussion with the French consul and that the French government was willing to cooperate in such an evacuation. Stevenson's proposal met with no enthusiasm at all in London. In fact, he was reprimanded for having taken this initiative. Consuls are not expected and not supposed to attempt to shape foreign policy. Still less are they expected to assume the authority to discuss such controversial proposals with foreign governments. And he was told very firmly not to pursue the idea. On the face of it, one might have thought that Prime Minister Baldwin would have viewed the proposal with some sympathy. After all, Baldwin had the most morbid dread of this new kind of aerial bombardment. The bomber will always get through, he had said, very prophetically, just 5 years earlier. But no, he was not enthusiastic for the idea of the evacuation. The climate here will not suit them, he said. He obviously knew nothing about the weather in the Basque Country. In the Foreign Office, there was even stiffer opposition. There, the argument was that evacuating non-combatants, useless mouths, was the phrase used by the British ambassador. Evacuating non-combatants would contravene the Treaty of Non-Intervention. So there the matter might have rested. There would have been no evacuation, none of us would be here today. But for one thing. And one thing, of course, was Guernica. Guernica changed everything. Now, set against what was to befall cities throughout Europe in the next few years, you could say that Guernica was trivial. But it was the first. That's the point. It was the first. The first bombing of the Second World War, Anthony Eden later called it. And being the first, it had the power to provoke widespread revulsion. Consul Stevenson, who had walked among the ruins and the ashes the very next day, submitted his detailed report to the Foreign Office, and ignoring his earlier reprimand, he ended it with a plea. "I have, though," he wrote, "strong views on the question of the evacuation of women and children, even if it is only a few thousand. And if anything can be done in this respect before it is too late, so much the better. In many ways, it seems to me that Consul Ralph Stevenson was the unsung hero of this entire story, this whole episode. He made the cause of rescuing Basque children in peril his own. And in doing so, he was hugely influential, both in Bilbao and in London. Meetings of the Basque government would be interrupted to receive him, and his reports were quoted at length in British cabinet meetings. There is absolutely no doubt that Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden came to regard him very highly and would have put great store by his report on the destruction of Guernica. But by now, Stevenson's was no longer a lone voice. Simultaneously in London, the National Joint Committee for Spanish Relief was petitioning the government to grant approval for an evacuation of children from the area around Bilbao. This committee had been formed at the end of 1936 to coordinate all the voluntary efforts, all the activities being undertaken by a plethora of political and non-political organisations. It was chaired by the maverick Conservative MP, the Duchess of Atholl, and its principal secretary, and I think it's true to say in many ways its driving force, was the Liberal MP, Wilfred Roberts. So then, in the immediate aftermath of Guernica, in the 2 or 3 weeks when the agony that had been inflicted upon that little town was still vivid in the public imagination, the National Joint Committee was able to take the initiative and obtain approval for a limited evacuation from the region. Now, approval was in fact granted just 3 days after the bombing of Guernica, but it was approval only in principle. It was not until the middle of May that the government's agreement was finally obtained and cabled to Stevenson in Bilbao. Long before that, however, the process that led to the evacuation had built up a quite irresistible momentum of its own. Now, with all this going on in London, what was happening in Bilbao, where most certainly the bombers were getting through every day, usually several times every day. There, Leah Manning, another of the resourceful and energetic members of the National Joint Committee, was negotiating with President Aguirre and other members of his Basque government, broadcasting regularly on Bilbao radio, and coordinating the details of the evacuation with the Asistencia Social. And as if further pressure was needed, Consul Stevenson was cabling the Foreign Office to report that he was being inundated with requests from anxious parents. Not surprisingly, within the Foreign Office, there were genuine fears that the committee, the Basque Children's Committee, was planning a fait accompli, as one official put it, several shiploads of refugees arriving in Portsmouth, whom it would be impossible for us to turn back without a public outcry. That was the pressure that was being put upon this government, which had been so initially reluctant to allow the evacuation of the children. In the midst of all this, one senior official in the Foreign Office wrote to the government and urged them to make up their minds between the conflicting pulls of humanitarian concern on the one hand and the non-intervention treaty on the other hand. His advice was ignored. The government never really did make up its mind. The government's policy was certainly never made unambiguously public. In fact, on the day before the 4,000 children left Santurce on the Havana, the government Foreign Office Committee met, and in the privacy of that meeting conceded that allowing the evacuation to take place had been wrung from them.